Evening all on Play Chess, and I'm streaming to Twitch TV, Kingscrusher. So I thought we could carry on from last week looking at Mikhail Tal in the USSR Championship of 1957, but with the white pieces. Okay, so there's some really classic encounters in this 1957 tournament. If you haven't already got it, by the way, there's a book called The Life and Games of Mikhail Tal by Tal himself. It's I think one of the greatest chess books written. It's really interesting. I really want to try and read it all. Okay, so in 1957, Tal had already created this reputation, and a lot of people were following this event just to see his sacrificial style, which was stunning the chess world. So let's look at his game against David Bronstein, who is another excellent dynamic player, and another excellent book called The Sorcerer's Apprentice is one I'm reading as well. Very recommendable books by both players. So Mikhail played d4 and David Bronstein plays c6. So with c6 he's inviting the possibility of Caro-Kann if e4, but also a Slav, of course, if c4. So this is not a normal, like what you'd expect maybe from Tal, the white side of a Slav, and things get even more interesting from a kind of stylistic expectation, because after knight c3 d5, okay, knight f3, David chooses g6, and okay, believe it or not, Mikhail plays a bit like Vladimir Kramnik recently against Iranian. C takes d5, an exchange Slav, which is very, very solid for white. Bishop f4. Okay, so knight c6, e3. So Tal was playing a lot of things with white pieces, but opening theory wasn't so aggressively analysed back then in 1957. So I guess it was easier to just play anything. Okay, so bishop g7, bishop e2, and now both sides castle. And David now plays knight h5, which, okay, tries to get the dark side bishop. Clearly it has to move. Does it want to go to g5? Maybe you might find it a little bit surprising. It goes actually to e5. So white's not too concerned about doubling pawns here. If knight takes, we would have frontal pressure on d5, and if, you know, what can black really do about that? That would be uncomfortable, and then there'll be a threat of g4 winning the knight potentially. So, you know, say e6, g4 would be nasty. So this position wasn't really perhaps attractive to David Bronstein. Instead, he plays f6, which suffers from some side effects. You know, maybe this diagonal will be weaker a bit later. Something like e4 could be more effective than usual because of this diagonal being slightly weakened. For the moment, bishop g3. Okay, he's having to give up his dark square bishop, though. So that's a small success maybe for black. That okay, at least he's got the bishop here. But okay, bishop e6. And now b7 is targeted, queen b3, interestingly. And although it allows a seemingly routine and useful knight a5, and you might think, well, black can use the c4 square on this semi-open file. But after knight a5, an interesting move positionally. We see queen b4. Okay, so queen b4. Putting some pressure on that diagonal. Well, that'd be interesting in this position. Also, keeping an eye on the knight, so the queen's tied down at the moment. If b6, well, that's just asking for light square weaknesses, you know, for something like bishop a6. So b6 is out of the question. Okay, so maybe black is a little bit uncomfortable here. He plays bishop f7. Okay, and now Mikhail plays rook fd1. And it looks as though after rook fd1 that this d pawn could be quite a nuisance. Say e4, trying to blast this d pawn forward could be quite useful. We see e6, reinforcing d5, but e4 is played anyway in this position. If black has time, you might also imagine, you know, something like rook e8 and bishop f8 to harass the queen, parked on that diagonal at the moment. But rook b8 here is played, and there's another idea emerging here that David Bronstein is interested in playing b5 and maybe justifying the knight, bringing it back to the centre with knight c4. And in fact, that's what happens here. Queen a3, and we see b5 being played. But it's a dynamic move, b5, perhaps overly so, because a forcing move from white will win potentially the a7 pawn or the b5 pawn. If this forcing move is played now, b4, so if the knight goes back to c6, well then b5 will drop. So the knight goes to c4. So David is basically sacrificing the a7 pawn for his entrenched knight on c4. But he might think, well, he's got the bishop pair. Surely this a7 pawn, you know, can white really get away with this? Well, what's the alternative? The queen going to b3 or a3 or taking this pawn? How many of you would dare to take this pawn here? If I give you 20 seconds here, would you actually take that pawn? Or would you do something else? So 20 seconds to have a look at this. Would you move the queen away or take a7? Anyone? So take the pawn. Well, actually, yeah, Mikhail did dare to take. So, well, your first concern maybe should be, well, the simple rook a8. What would happen here? In the game, we saw bishop e8 reinforcing b5. But let's say rook a8. Maybe our queen can go to c5, possibly. I haven't really checked this with an engine, but queen c5, then b5 is attacked. Maybe it's okay. Okay, so we see taking the pawn bishop e8, which reinforces, of course, b5, and also rook f7 could be handy to attack the queen. Bishop takes c4 is now played. And the queen is actually attacked here, and it moves back to a3. B takes c4. Even though white has snatched that pawn, black still has the bishop pair, a solid position, and a potentially reinforced passed pawn here. On the other hand, white has two pawns here, which, you know, could be very, very useful in theory if they could get moving. Okay, so e takes d5 is played. E takes d5. White's accomplished an e-file which might be useful for an invasion later. Queen b2. Okay, and yeah, if these pawns are just given some time, they could get menacing, you know, proportions. We see g5 from black. Okay, queen d2, which tactically is protecting the pawn, because if, you know, rook takes, then there's knight d5. But actually that was played. It was played, losing that centre pawn. And one might think, well, given that's the case, what could black do instead? Black is faced with potentially a4 and b5, which would start locking down the bishop, and these pawns are getting dangerous. So maybe David thought the best thing was to take on b4. Okay. Knight takes d5. For those of you just joining now, this is Mikhail Tal against David Bronstein. It's the first game having a look at from the Moscow tournament of 1957. And we'll go over it again briefly after this. So knight takes d5. Hitting the rook, double attack. The rook goes back. And the knight goes to e3 now, hitting c4 and also eyeing f5. That could be very useful. f5 square. We see rook c8 protecting the pawn that again attacked and again defended. And now rook c3 preparing to just double against it. So there's a lot of pressure now mounting on that c pawn. Bishop g6. Okay, more pressure on the c pawn. And deciding perhaps here that bishop d3 perhaps is not good enough. Instead the bishop goes to f7. Maybe on bishop d3, you know, knight e1 is good, for example. So the bishop goes to f7. Now d5, again renewing the threat against the pawn, blocking the bishop's protection. Okay, so at the moment Mikhail is one pawn up. He's potentially going to be two pawns up. Okay, bishop f8 is played. For the moment d5 is under fire, so it's not easy to take without losing d5. So here for a moment bishop b4 is also threatening the skewer, so a3 stops that. Bishop c5. You might think black's got some compensation here. That dark square bishop looks potentially dangerous. But isn't c4 tactically on now? Okay. Well, actually rook takes c4 is played, not fearing bishop takes e3, which isn't played. If bishop takes e3, rook takes c7. If it takes here, rook takes c8 on the queen. That's not possible. Bishop takes e3. Instead the bishop takes on a3. Okay. And still, you know, white's a pawn up. So this cheeky pawn grab from earlier seems to be working out just fine so far. But again, you know, you could argue that the two knights versus the two bishops, surely the bishops could provide compensation for the pawn. Rook takes c7, so the rooks come off. And now queen d4 hitting f6. This queen is a monster in the center here, actually. And maybe it's marking out white's being a little bit better if you consider all the different imbalances. Check. Okay, and now queen b2 not only hits the queen, but also f2. And Mikhail doesn't mind losing f2 here. He plays this dynamic move, queen e4. So he's offering f2, but that isn't taken in this position. If queen f2, maybe knight g4 hitting the queen and f6. Let's have a quick look. Queen f2, knight g4 is going to be a bit dangerous. It's looking a little bit nasty. I guess you could play queen b2, but you know the pressure could mount up here. And there's things like knight h6 as well. Okay, so queen e4 is played, and now so bishop f8 is played, not queen takes f2. Okay, knight d4 going into that f5 square, maybe knight e6 or going into f5. It's getting a little bit desperate for black here actually, and this move looks a little bit desperate. But what about f2 being on pre all the time? Not taken here again. Again, knight g4, you know, is always dangerous, isn't it? Attacking f6. So h5 is played, which means that f2 really does seem on now, because knight g4 has been ruled out by that pawn. Knight dc2 does seem to protect that f2 pawn, and we get an invitation for a repetition. We get queen b7, and after knight d4, you know, repetition offer. You want to draw basically, but this is kind of virtually refused now. With f2 really being on without knight g4, Mikhail now goes in with knight e6. So can black really safely take on f2? Well, it does restore material, and he's tempted to. He does play it. Queen takes f2. No knight g4 to face, but knight f5. What does this immediately threaten? Knight f5. Okay, well, one thing is knight takes here, and then queen e7, so that's one kind of threat. Black plays h4, and we do see that being implemented, even though g3 looks a bit of a worry. Knight takes f8. After h takes g3, the knight maintains its position on f5 by the king going forward. So the knight wants to support queen e7 check. So we see this potentially, but no, actually black here first slips in queen g1, which does threaten, well, it threatens seemingly menacing threats like queen h2 and bishop h5 would be mate if the king's on g4. So okay, so Mikhail does take this pawn on g3 first before doing anything else. King takes f8, but after check, black is actually in a lost position here. He's going to lose material because king g8, if he played on, there's knight h6 check, winning the bishop. So he resigned here. It was an interesting encounter, and shows, I don't know, it shows Mikhail's not afraid to take even an a7 pawn and sort of try and defend that position and go for an attack later. Let's have a quick review of that. So Slav defense, exchange Slav, you might think it's a little bit dull, and it seems, you know, black was playing quite dynamically, getting the bishop pair and basically, you know, sacking a pawn for a seemingly strong knight on c4. But yeah, this is not just on the diagonal, it is on a7, and it's an important point, it seems, that well, black's made this into a gambit, which is kind of accepted. So it's the onus is on black to prove this compensation. Okay. Now maybe with computers, I don't know, there's more precise moves than the game here. But in the game, it seems white is okay. Queen is safely coming back. Black has the bishop pair, but black's onslaught isn't too hot. And in fact, offering up the centre pawn now by taking on b4. What else is there? If g4, just knight h4, coming into f5, it's not that pleasant. So knight takes d5, hitting the rook. Knight e3. We see a lot of pressure built on c4. This d5, now a3, cutting down black's option. So a pawn up here, faced against the bishop pair, but both sides now not minding this position. Queen d4, again black's got the bishop pair, but white's got that extra pawn. And this issue with f2 is dealt with tactically with queen e4 for this knight g4. So f6 is a bit of a problem here. Okay, so bishop f8, knight d4, again offering f2, but now h5, it looks as though queen f2 is really on. We get this position again, but now knight e6. So this idea of getting the knight here for knight f8 is really dangerous in this position, and that's what really basically won the game here. Knight takes f8. It's a crushing tactic because the check and the bishop is loose for knight h6. So here black resigned. Okay, let's have a look at another game from this championship. So now this is a very interesting game from a stylistic point of view, because Victor Korchnoi, now we'll have a look at the game against Victor Korchnoi, because he was a great defender, and in a way kind of, if anyone was to prove Not a very nice style for Mikhail to play against. It was Victor, because he was into provoking the opponents into attack, and he loved defending. And I think Mikhail admitted a certain difficulty conceptually playing against Victor Korchnoi in his book Life and Games of Mikhail Tal. His record's not brilliant against Victor Korchnoi. It's the style incompatibility, like playing scissors, paper, stone in the chess sense. If you're a stone, you don't want to play the paper, do you? So Victor's ready to sort of grab material and defend. Okay, so he plays after e4. Mikhail plays e4. Victor plays French defense. So d4, d5. Now after knight c3, an unusual move, but this is in Watson's Dangerous Weapons book nowadays. If you look at Watson's French defense dangerous weapons, knight c6, it's got some interesting ideas to it. So knight f3 is played, and we see bishop b4, e5, and okay, sometimes in certain variations black would undermine the centre of its head, but here the system's being used for black to castle queenside with b6, try and get to castle queenside like this. So that's how the system's being used here. Bishop d3, queen d7. Okay, so bishop d2, bishop b7. Okay, after castles, this looks a bit anti-development, but it's a closed position now. Bishop f8. Bishop f8. Black's going to castle queenside, so how can Tal get an attack from this position? It's quite difficult, actually. This fianchetto bishop does offer some defence for the black king on the queen side, and also you've got to factor in with the white king here. If you try and blast black open later with c4, this diagonal could be useful to black potentially, especially if there's a g file. So just think about that. But a3, we see f5. If black's allowed to get away with f5 in this position, then you can imagine things maybe building up like this later. So that might be annoying to white, and this is why perhaps the decision was made to sort of go for a frontal attack on e6 with en passant, to get more pressure on e6. Looks logical, but we'll see actually Victor, he doesn't mind this e6 pawn. He doesn't mind defending it. If necessary with knight d8, he can defend this e6 pawn, and we'll see that. So g takes f6, queen e2. Okay, after castles we see the frontal pressure with rook fe1, rook e8, not minding, and that vacates of course the knight for d8 if needed. The tactical bishop f5. Victor is just soaking all up, knight d8, no problem. Okay, a4. Should a5 be a worry, or can black just close up potentially the position? Well, for a moment black doesn't need to decide on that yet. He can attack the bishop here with knight h6, and he doesn't mind getting the dark square bishop. That will also attack the rook if this is protected by that one. So the bishop actually goes to h3, keeping an eye on e6. And now we see a decision about this attack, in inverted commas, a5. What to do about it? Simply a6. So a5 can be answered easily by b5, keeping everything shut down. So knight a2 is played. Okay, king b8. Knight b4, a threat. Okay. Now actually Vic doesn't mind giving up his dark square bishop here. He does play bishop takes b4, and of course bishop takes, well, there's bishop takes e1, so bishop takes b4, queen g7. It looks as though, hang on, there's some pressure here on this g file to deal with. Where is white's attack? At the moment, well, it's not really an attack. It's a positional move, maybe a5, just fixing down black's pawns more, maybe trying to block this bishop, keep this bishop blocked. Maybe useful to white. b3, as though there's a potential for c4, but clearly in this position it's all pretty dangerous at the moment to consider c4. You might think it's dangerous to consider c4, but indeed after rook hg8, funny enough, in this position c4 is actually played. Now you might think, well, hang on a sec, surely this is so tempting to take here. The thing is, black might not have a concrete attack here on g2, so if black did takes, then white is still lingering over with this threat of c takes b5. Black cannot easily, it seems, prove something on g2, so c takes b5 is really on the cards. So maybe black's king will be in question, the king safety here. Victor's decision against c4, so I've led you up the garden path for this diagonal, but Victor's decision is actually to play bishop c6. This looks like the more solid defensive try to keep everything locked down, actually, because this pawn is basically kept on b3, isn't it? If you take here, you're sort of liberating this pawn to join and rip open the b file. Okay, so rook hg8, c4. Okay, we see bishop c6. It keeps everything closed down on that queen side. g3. Okay. Now knight f5, as though there might be some sort of threat going on soon. Here we see c takes b5, bishop takes b5. This pawn is helping black's king just in the way. There's no real b-file attack with this pawn on b3, so it has actually helped black's king safety a lot. Queen c2, and we see knight c6. Okay, I don't think any exchange sack works here like rook e6, but with knight d4 on especially, this has to be protected. So bishop c5 protects d4. Okay, queen d7. And we see bishop f1, maybe trying to work something up against the king at some point. Rook takes f1, knight d6. The knight is taking the place potentially of that bishop on b5 now. It's eliminated. C takes d6, accumulating more pawns in the centre. Rook fc1, that's protected by the king, that knight. Queen d2. Rook c8. So where is white's attack? And now the knight here goes to b5, potentially. An exchange of rooks, knight b5. Black seems as safe as ever now. Where's white's attack? Queen f4, queen e7. Pawn had to be protected. Queen c1. Queen hangs round with queen d7. Queen f4, hitting f6 again. f6 is offered a little trap. So if queen takes f6, there's rook f7 on f3. So white plays king g2, protecting the knight, really threatening now queen f6. Rook f7, really protecting the pawn. Queen h6. White can't break through here. This is a fortress. This is why Tal finds difficulty, perhaps. This is an example why Tal found it difficult to pick down Viktor Korchnoi. It's pretty solid all the way through, really. In this position, they agree a draw here. What can white do? He's pretty safe. Nice blockade on the queen side where he part the king. stylistically it's an interesting game. It's not a decisive game, but I thought it's interesting because Viktor Korchnoi was one of the strongest players never to become world champion, was playing for you know, the Russian Olympiad team for very successfully, etc. Maybe, you know, second to Karpov for many years. So they agreed to draw here. So let's have a quick look at this game again. So an interesting opening system for the French defence player. It's castle queenside, protect e6, keep everything locked up on the queen side, not minding giving up the bishop there. And the knights are quite good here for black, especially for that b5 point. Trying to get that b5 point with a piece is a nice part of this game. It keeps everything secure. So nothing to write home about here now. So draw agreed. Now let's have a look at another interesting pairing in this tournament against Boris Spassky, and a slightly contrasting style is evident just from the opening choice. So Spassky's really aggressive, hyper aggressive opening repertoire. So as well as being a King's Gambit exponent, he's basically playing the King's Gambit in reverse in this game, as we'll see. So Mikhail playing e4, and the King's Gambit in reverse, well, it's kind of some of the same principles vaguely. Schliemann f5, very aggressive. Okay, so black can try and generate a good centre from this and good piece play. So knight c3, knight f6. So offering the f5 pawn, that is taken. And you might think, interestingly, that black shouldn't be playing this next move. This next move is illegal. I wonder if you can guess, actually, this is theoretical, but still, if you haven't been through Schliemann theory, I don't know how Schliemann is evolved that much, but what do you think black plays here? What do you think Boris Spassky plays here if I give you 20 seconds starting from now? No, he's already one pawn down, but what does black play here? So 20 seconds starting from now. Okay, he sacks another pawn, knight d4. He's offering up e5 as well. So 2 pawns down. And you're right, this is a bit of a dangerous opening. Very dangerous opening to play. What's going on here? 2 pawns down. So bishop c5. Okay. Both sides castle. But the point is revealed soon. You know, knight f3. We see c6. This is nice for constructing a centre and at least trying to get one pawn back. Knight takes d4. We see some congestion issues because these guys, this d4, not being able to play d4 is a nuisance. So if black can get his one pawn back, that might not be too bad. So at the moment, Spassky is playing 2 pawns down quite casually. Dynamic opening choice. Big contrast to the French defence of the Korchnoi game. So knight e2, bishop e5, knight g3, reinforcing f5. Knight e4 is played. Okay. And here, obviously, you don't want to play this. This would be a silly thing to do, because a queen h4 hitting h2 and e4. I believe that would be a silly thing to do. So, okay. So instead, actually, bishop takes e4 is played. D takes e4. And now trying to liberate this bishop, at least. I know white's 2 pawns up, but black's going to be regaining this pawn just to be a pawn down. Okay, so d3. And Okay, e takes d3 is played. Queen takes d3. Queen takes d3. C takes d3. Now black just is content to play the opposite colour bishop position. So he takes on g3, gets his pawn back. Opposite colour bishops, alert. He's only a pawn down, and this d pawn is a nice target on the d file in any case. Okay, so d4, and now some pressure on d pawn. Nice blockade on d5. It is difficult to win this position, surely. You might think. I don't know. If I gave you 20 seconds to evaluate here, do you not think black has strong drawing chances? That's the question. Opposite coloured bishops is only a pawn down. Although the opening was perhaps slightly outrageous, going 2 pawns down. Isn't this okay? What do you think? 20 seconds starting from now. Can I go 12-04 and play chess? Draw. Black is completely equal. Yeah, black. I think black's mostly equal here. So let's have a look at the game continuation. Rook d5. Okay, rook d8. Blockade. Nothing much going on, really. All the pawns now on light squares, away from the bishop. Magnus Carlsen would approve, I think, of that. So, okay, bishop b5, another nice piece on b5. Okay, check. Bishop c4, a2 is vulnerable as well, and on a light square at the moment. Rook f1, bishop e3, and they agree a draw. Okay, so it was interesting considering the opening. Okay, it fizzled into a draw. But I find, interesting that Boris Spassky, to play Boris Spassky in 1957 is a big game. So let's have a quick look at it again, this opening. So double pawn sack, and black's okay. He's playing for c6 and d5, and he doesn't mind getting his pawn back under certain circumstances just to be a pawn down. Blockade, draw shortly follows. Okay, it's nice to draw with black. Try and win with white. Okay, so let's have a look at another game. So this is another big name, another former world champion, Tigran Petrosian. Okay, so Mikhail playing e4 against Tigran, e6. Petrosian's a difficult player to beat. So d4, d5, and we see knight c3 being chosen here. None of this Tarrasch stuff. Bishop b4. Winnower. Okay, Winnower takes knight e7, which is a kind of positional continuation to be able to play knight f5 if g7 was really attacked. And you might think, is it a waste of time playing queen g4 here? Is it a total waste of time to play queen g4 here? That's an interesting question, isn't it? It is actually play queen g4. Okay, knight f5, bishop d3, the queen is kicked, queen h3. Let me see, c takes d4, and this potentially looks a bit of a pain, this position. So one question is, what would happen if c takes d4 is played? It wasn't actually played, but there's, this bishop's probably being liberated. So in the game actually we saw knight f3, just making a pawn sacrifice here. Okay, so knight c6, g4, trying to kick that knight back using the pin, of course. So knight goes back, and he won a pawn, but is it a token pawn? It's double pawns, but this g-file is great for white. Surely this g-file justifies white's play. He's got pressure on g7, and this g7 is going to be reinforced really badly. So we'll see. Queen c7, attacking e5, that's protected. Now knight g6 using the pin. Queen g4, offering the dark square bishop up. It looks like a bit of an overprotection gambit. Nimzowitsch would like the overprotection of e5 here. So knight takes f4, queen takes f4, d takes c3. Black a pawn up, but okay, and double pawns here. You might think, well, hang on. In fact, is it more than a pawn up? 3, 4, 5, 6. No, it's a pawn up. 7 for black. But g-file pressure, overprotection of e5. Maybe bishop's not so hot. This bind on e5 is interesting. The g-file is interesting. So queen g5, putting immediate threat to g7. And difficult to defend that g7 here. Difficult to defend because rook g8 runs into bishop h7, I think. Bishop h7 here. That would be pretty bad. And then you can take on g7 and protect e5 when the rook moves. So actually, Petrosian, he does his own pawn sack now. He plays queen e7, offering up g7 like this for queen f8. And he's going to make use of this h6 square as well. Queen g5, queen h6. And should the game peacefully settle into a draw from here? Maybe this is the intention. The intention all along, just win this pawn over here, sack g7, get the queens off. Okay, but the game continues. So rook g1, and Tigran takes the queens off. Bishop d7. So is white doing well here? That g-file looks quite tasty for white. King e2, he can easily double on it, control that g-file. This passed pawn might be dangerous later. We'll see. King e7, king e3, rook a f8, rook ag1, marking out that g-file, bishop e8, knight d4, not minding, trying to get rid of that defensive knight. If he can get rid of that defensive knight, maybe the king can use d4 to get this one. f5 is played in this position, which does slightly weaken second rank. Knight takes c6, and now this pawn is under threat. King e4. Okay. f4. We see check, and now rook g8, which is interesting because if rook takes h5, then I believe bishop g6 would skewer. Sorry, pardon me. Double attack both rooks. I don't think that's good for black at all. So rook g8. Okay, he gets rid of that h8 rook. Rook takes g8. Rook takes g8. So there's still an imminent threat now. There's really a passed pawn, which is really, really dangerous. I don't think there was any tactic there on h3 or anything. So this passed pawn is really dangerous here. So rook f8 is played, and can white actually win this bishop and pawn ending? Well, we'll see, because it goes now into that bishop and pawn ending with this dangerous looking passed pawn over here. So white is technically a pawn up, but these are double pawns. Okay, it isn't opposite coloured bishops, so let's see. Bishop g6. Okay, king a5 prepares this sort of positional threat that the 2-to-1 pawn majority can create a passed pawn soon if needed. c3, king g8, waiting around, check. Now bishop f7, that's protected, e6 protected. Bishop g8, so keeping an eye on e6, trying to tie down both king and bishop. Okay, it's getting a little bit passive for black. But what is white's winning method? Well, he plays king d3, and there's a little tactic now coming up that black uses to seemingly generate a dangerous passed pawn. King e2 has clearly the intention of rounding up this pawn, but in doing so the king's putting d4 as a potential serious threat to take this away and then smash through with a passed pawn. And we see that in action soon. King h8, king f3, b5. So this pawn is being offered for this idea of d4 and b4, which looks really dangerous. So this had to be calculated quite carefully, I guess. So king takes f4. There's a refutation of this whole defensive concept. d4 is played. After c takes d4, b4, creating that dangerous passed pawn. And with the bishop locked in over there, that's not going to help, is it? You might think. Well, there's a little bit of a surprise here coming up. After a takes b4, a4, we see white playing d5. He's just blasting that diagonal open to protect against the a2 pawn. And it is in time. It's totally in time. So a3, d takes e6. So this bishop is influencing a2 here. Petrosian tries his luck with a2 anyway, leaving his bishop and that pawn to queen. Okay, he's a bishop down. He's got a few checks to use up, but fundamentally he's a bishop down, and here he resigned. So that was an interesting French defense encounter against Tigran Petrosian. Let's have a quick look at it again. So French defense winner. So it wasn't apparently a waste of time to play queen g4. So knight e7 looks as though the purpose of this system is against queen g4, but queen g4 is played anyway. Then we have this kind of gambit of a pawn here that white uses to keep an active position. So knight f3, because white wants to play g4. Okay, so knight c6, g4, g takes, and he's got that g file. He doesn't mind giving up the dark square bishop. He's got a bind on the position. This e5 point, Nimzowitsch would like overprotecting e5. So queen g5, Tigran sacks the g pawn to try and get the queens off, but there's still something left for white to do in this position. So it is still dangerous. So the winning plan we saw was like bringing the king here, taking this guy off, then you can munch that pawn. So that was the method there. So knight d4. Okay, then winning that c3 pawn in time. Also creating this h pawn now is really dangerous. And we see now basically, as well as taking that, he comes back for this one, not minding this scenario. Okay, that's the basic pattern here. So he's coming back for the f4 pawn, tying down the bishop. Now here we see this with king d3. So white gonna just win this one. And black's going to play this d4. It's just not enough. The bishop's actually very good on here. It's very good on this diagonal, as it turned out. So this is not helping too much. So a takes b4, a4, d5. It's just winning for white. It looks as though it's winning for white without too much of an issue. Okay, so he managed to beat Tigran Petrosian, who's a very difficult player to beat in the French defence. Let's have a look at another game. So, against Konstantin Klaman, not as well known as his previous opponents we've gone through. Let's have a look at this game. So, Konstantin Klaman plays actually a Sicilian defense. Knight f3, knight c6, d4, an open Sicilian, knight f6, e6, bishop g5 is played, bishop d7. So queen d2 looks like a standard aggressive idea, you know, castle queenside. Black's not too keen to develop into an attack, not moving this bishop. Black tries to just have a solid position with queenside counterplay. So he takes on d4, queen a5, hitting the bishop. That takes on f6, structural damage, but giving black the bishop pair. So rook c8, can black just play on the queenside here? f4, rook g8, g3, e6. Okay, so bishop h3. It's difficult maybe to break down black. Black with the bishop pair looks quite solid. Okay, the king's in the center, but is it so easy to break black down here? Especially after a move like queen d5. Okay, and then black is launching his own attack with b5. It looks very, very naughty to do this with the king in the center. So how can he get away with it? Well, okay, rook he1, and it looks at first, you know, maybe is there going to be a knight d5 on b4 just to punish black? Well, actually, in this position, no, there isn't knight d5. There is knight e2 played here. The knight can reroute like this if needed. Okay, so queen c4, king b1. And offering e4, well, the king is in the center. A pawn's not as bad as a knight to sacrifice. Knight d4. It looks as though black's really being pushing his luck here. King in the center against Mikhail Tal. Queen d3 on h7. Bishop e7. So he's not bothering to defend h7, he just tucks his rook on f8. Okay, is black at all solid here? Well, actually this next move does question the king in center in a slightly different way. Bishop g4 implies that bishop h5 and then e6 is going to be in trouble. We see queen c7. For the moment, knight and queen are protecting c2. King a1, interesting move. Calm before the storm. So here, you might think, is it useful for black to play king d8, in fact? If we assume that this is the main threat, bishop h5 and knight e6, what if black did try king d8 as an example? How would you break black down here? If I give you 20 seconds, starting from now, is it possible? I think I see something myself. I can show you what I see myself actually. I think you can still play bishop h5. You know, because bishop h5 could be useful to win f7. If bishop h5, for example, bishop e8, there's rook e6 here. That would be nice for a fork on queen and king. So it's difficult actually to defend f7 here. If you can take f7, then e6 is going to be weak. So this is dangerous for black, as an example. So black actually, he played f5, which looks like he's really asking for a piece sacrifice now. And he does get it with the king in the center. Okay, he has put his luck. Bishop takes f5. The king is exposed. Rook takes e7 check. Okay, but the game continues. Okay, so what's been sacrificed so far? A bishop and the exchange. So white's basically playing a rook down at the moment. So rook e1 check. And now if bishop here, then you can take with the rook or the knight. That's that pin. So king d8, check, f6, queen h6, and it's difficult to defend this now, this f8 rook. If the rook moves, then black gets mated. So black is doing an evacuation tactic now. He plays queen a5, offering up the rook to get the king to c7. It looks a little bit desperate, and black's structure has been wrecked here, double pawns here. But also, hang on a sec though, queen takes f8, king c7, attacking the queen, and also b3 would be attacking e1 and a2. This is a bit naughty. So actually, in this position, Tal actually decides to attack the queen first. Important perhaps to attack the queen first and then take on f8. Okay, so queen d5, now he takes on f8, king c7, queen takes f6. White's material up here, surely he's like 2 pawns up past h pawn. It looks okay, it looks 2 pawns up, doesn't look as though there's too many problems. Rook c1, he doesn't want to be back row mated or anything just yet. He wants to use this c file to get the black's king again. Bishop a4. Okay, queen d4, queen b7, rook d1. Black's passive now as well, and after the check, that's crushing. It's crushing, because if king d7, I think knight c5 is good. Just winning the queen. So he's just won the rook basically. So here black resigned. So it was perhaps the most provocative opponent yet that we've had a look at. He left his king in the centre, and you know, the bishop g4 was signalling dangerous news. Okay, so let's have a look at that again. So the king was left in the centre here by Konstantin Klaman, but it didn't really last that long. Okay, even though there were no immediate open files against the king, there was a temptation maybe to play knight d5 that was resisted. Doesn't really do anything concrete here. So instead, well, black's opening up a line, that centre line, and it's just too difficult to defend this position now. It's surely, after bishop h5, this is too difficult to defend. Even if the king makes a run for it, losing f7 would really be kind of bad for black. So we see queen c7, king a1, calm before the storm, f5, and now bishop sack, exchange sack, playing a rook down here temporarily. He's about to get his rook back, but first plays knight b3 to stop any b3 stuff from black. He gets his rook back with 2 pawn advantage, and just consolidates now. It's consolidation, d6 major target. Black loses the rook here to queen c4 check. Okay, these games are really complex. Just skimming through them really. I'll put, you know, when I upload this on YouTube, you know, get the PGN from the description of the video on YouTube, and you know, check it out with engines. We're just doing a feel for the games without in-depth technical analysis really. So let's have a look, just one more. I want to just have a look at the games with white against Tolush. Now this is quite interesting, because it was in a King's Engine defense. Actually, I didn't put the PGN properly there, did I? No, okay, PGN's not going in properly, but we'll see how it plays out. So c4, knight f6. Now this is David Bronstein again. Uh-oh, hold on a sec. Better. Okay, so against Tolish in the last round, we see c4. Okay, and we get Mikhail playing on the white side of the Simish variation against the King's Indian defence. So f3, one of my favourites. So e5 is played by Tolish, knight ge2, knight bd7, bishop g5. Okay, c6, queen d2, preparing maybe to castle queenside, and a kind of standard hack attack like this. After castles, white closes the centre. So white's got a ready-made plan to get rid of the dark square bishop as well. c5, so black might be relying now on a6 and b5 for counterplay. That closing up with c5 is sometimes quite controversial. So very close position now. g4 is without any counterplay immediately in the centre. a6, so there's plan for b5 to generate some queenside counterplay. Knight g3. So later, you know, we can get a pawn here, we can get the queen here, for example. So rook e8, h4, queen a5. Dark square bishop exchange, bishop h6 is safe enough to play, knight f8. Doesn't take immediately on g7, instead he plays h5. And also there's another idea for this f5 to be used, for that g file to be dangerous. So queen c7, bishop d3, b5, he castles queenside, and doesn't mind sacking the c4 pawn. He plays bishop b1. These knights are not really, well, where is black's counterplay? Is it really going to be dangerous on b2 here? It's going to take too long for black to arrange a counter-attack. Black looks to be in serious problems here already, actually. So bishop h8, rook dg1, just slowly preparing this knight f5. We've actually seen this game maybe once or twice before, so it's always fun to have a look at it again. So this is in stark contrast maybe to other games that you know, closed position, doesn't matter about being a pawn down here, it's token pawn for the moment. B file doesn't seem that effective. Black pretends as though he's going to use it for something with rook b8, but we get knight f5, and you might not think, well, is there actually a concrete threat with knight f5? Both these knights are holding up h7. Okay, and d6, well, the queen's tied down to d6 a little bit. We see knight 6 to d7. Okay, so what does Mikhail play here? He plays actually bishop g5, which might carry a threat such as bishop e7, maybe even to just attack d6 could be tasty. Bishop g7 is played, but actually no. Now that the g file is kind of shielded, perhaps knight takes g7 is played, getting rid of that bishop. Check. And now opening up another line of attack, even if it gives black the e5 square. He does this. He plays f4, even though black can try and get a nice knight on e5. So e takes f4, queen takes f4. Queen d8 offers queen f6 as a defensive resource. hg, knight takes g6. Now queen h2. Okay, that looks good for h7 now to be in trouble at some point. But black's got the e5 square, and he uses that. Okay. Bishop f4. h7 is now under fire. That's protected. Is it easy to break black down here? These pieces are not particularly dynamic at the moment. They really need an e5 break, like in a kind of Benoni kind of theme, to liberate. Queen h6. It looks as though, you know, rook h5 could be dangerous, among other things. as well as bishop g5 to f6. Knight eg6, bishop g5. So this would be terminal to allow bishop f6 here. So f6, okay. And here, now these pieces explode into life. This is now where white just goes for it. He plays e5, so he's liberating this bishop. The knight's got the e4 square. It looks entirely thematic. So black takes on e5, and things just crash through really. Bishop takes g6. Okay, black tries rook b7 in this position. It just looks terrible. Knight e4, putting even more pressure on f6. So black takes that bishop. Rook f1, threatening all sorts of things like knight f6 and just taking on h7. Or rook takes f8 and then taking on h7 could be good to try and win the queen if nothing else. So rook takes e4 is tried here. Bishop takes e4. Material situation now. So black's only the exchange down for a pawn. So can black try and defend this position? Well, he plays rook g7. And we see actually rook f6. Attention like is being given to that d6 pawn, perhaps. So why would that be useful for white? But also, of course, white can now double on the f file against f8 as well. Bishop takes g4, and he does double on the f file. Knight d7, and now the d6 pawn is taken. Okay, queen e7. And there's another way to get to the black king. It doesn't matter about the bishop here, because white now plays rook takes a6. He wants to play rook a8 check. That'd be crushing coordination on f8 here. So this bishop can't be taken. King h8. Now it's all over really. Bishop takes h7 now. So if rook takes, we have check just crashing through, mating black. Black tries knight b8. Check from the queen. Check. After takes, rook takes e6. Black finally has had enough. Here's the exchange down. He's being attacked, and it looks pretty terminal actually. So that was interesting from the point of view of a closed position, bringing up the attack using the f5 square, and that's the concluding game. Let's just have a quick overview on that game. So King's Indian Simish. Played very aggressively again by Mikhail, casting queenside. He does use the h file a little bit, but there's an attention placed on the f5 sacrifice in this game that we saw. So okay, and he didn't mind giving black seemingly important positional square, the e5 square, but it didn't matter. It's not as relevant here as king safety. So the king safety issue emphasized here with this thematic e5, just liberating this bishop here. The knight is now free to use the e4 square. Massive move thematically to play. Okay, so rook takes e5, taking that pawn. Bishop takes g6. So in this position, he's got two bishops being attacked, and you know white's got to be careful. If he plays bishop takes, then rook takes, you know, and his queen's attacked. It's got to be something clear here. So knight e4 puts more pressure on f6. Okay, you know, if he had moved this bishop back anywhere, then maybe, you know, knight takes g6 would be okay potentially. So, you know, because you can imagine black having some sort of counterplay with knight d3 and this b pawn could be an issue. So he's got to be careful here. So knight e4 just adds more fuel to the fire, not moving any bishop back. And we saw, okay, one bishop now being taken, restoring a little bit of material balance. Okay, very serious threats now, like rook takes f8. So rook takes e4 is played, sacrificing the exchange. But now it's a combination of the f file and d6, which is causing black's downfall. And the point about d6 is, well, this rook is going like this. So rook takes a6. Crush. Okay, so it's a crushing position now. Okay, that's it. I hope you enjoyed this week. I'll be uploading to YouTube. Okay, so thanks very much. Have a good week. See you next week. Comments or questions on YouTube. Thanks very much.